When the end of the world came, most people began to panic. However, Jake Kwan felt something strange inside himself. This feeling could not be described in simple words. Some might call it calm. However, Jake Kwan had a different opinion on the matter. For him, it was more of an excitement. Let's go back a little to the end of the world. Jake Kwan stands next to his colleague, listening to an audiobook called 10 Tips to Become the Life of the Party. Tip number 1. Maintain eye contact so that the other person can see that you are interested in what he is saying. Deciding to take this advice, Jake Kwan began to stare at his colleague. The girl noticed this and, in order to relieve the tension, asked him how his weekend went, to which he, taking off his headphones, replied that, in principle, it was not bad. The girl said that she also had a good time and she and her husband wanted to go to the lake to fish, but in such weather they preferred to sit at home. After this small conversation, Jake Kwan headed to the elevator. Clutching his head, he asked himself one question. What the hell was wrong with him? Finding friends is a very difficult task. These are the thoughts that Vitaly has in his head. He took this job to try to start over, but years have passed and he still can't cope with the task. In this society that values social skills above all else, he doesn't know if he'll ever fit in. The only sports he did were those that allowed him to do alone. For example, sport archery. However, ultimately, this world is not created for people like him. That's why he sits here almost all the time now. He's sitting there without his own family in an office where hardly anyone knows his name. After these thoughts, a blond man approached him and waved his hand to attract attention. It was Adam, inviting Jake to come have lunch with them. Adam was a natural-born leader, the complete opposite of our hero, but Jake Kwan felt sympathy for him. Adam doesn't mind taking on the brunt of the conversation, which makes things easier for our hero. Also, Jake Kwan usually declines the offer to have lunch together, but with this guy, it might not be so awkward. So Jake Kwan agreed and they all headed out to have lunch together. The elevator doors opened and two colleagues came out in front of them. The red-haired one was called Carolina. She is one of the few vivid impressions our hero has from working in this place. They decided to go out to lunch, all 5 of them. Caroline looked at Jake and greeted him, saying that it was strange to see him walking with them. Jake Kwan noticed that she never says his name and that's because she simply doesn't know it. On the other hand, her attention is constantly focused on someone else. While Jake Kwan was thinking about this, suddenly the elevator stopped, causing a little panic. Adam immediately stated that everything was fine, and it was probably just a small problem with the wiring. However, after this, the elevator began to fall downwards. Adam immediately shouted for Jake Kwan to press the emergency button. I started drinking into this button with my fists, but there was no reaction. After that, the light suddenly disappeared. Adam looked around and asked, "Is everyone okay?" After a short conversation, everyone was convinced that no one had any serious injuries. And then a system notification appeared in front of them. It said that the initiation of the 93rd universe was complete and the introduction and start of the training sequence would now be launched. Exactly the same notification was received by all other residents of this world, and even some from outside. Let's return to our hero, who, like Keanu Reeves in The Matrix, found himself in the White Office without understanding how he was dragged there. In front of him sat a humanoid life form that greeted the man. Seeing this, Jake Kwan widened his eyes and asked the humanoid who he was. A timer appeared above the humanoid, and he stated that he was the entity responsible for introducing our hero to his new reality. The humanoid also said that they had a limited amount of time for this, so they needed to get started quickly. A system appeared in front of our hero and he asked what the new reality meant. And also, what does this system mean? To which the humanoid replied that the system where his various statistical data and other important details for the new reality are listed will now be his assistant. The humanoid also said that the system began its work when their universe finally crossed the minimum threshold required to enter the multiverse, and any additional information would be transmitted to him in the form he wanted. Jake Kwan said he can't even explain how he feels right now. After that, the humanoid pointed his finger and said that it was time for them to move on to training. A weapon selection table appeared in front of him, and Jake Kwan realized that this meant he had to choose one thing. Jake Kwan realized that each class would have different bars for stats and skills, and it all sounds more or less clear. Jake Kwan smiled and pointed at the bow. The system immediately congratulated him on choosing the student class, and the humanoid stated that the time allocated for familiarization was coming to an end. So now he will be transferred to the training area of the Great Forest. The humanoid warned that the Great Forest was full of dangers and opportunities for newly arrived players. Animals roam the forest hunting for prey. You need to kill animals to get training points or new, more destructive skills. You might even be lucky enough to hunt the Beastmasters themselves. Jake Kwan looked at the humanoid and asked how long the training would last, to which the monster replied that the training would last 64 days, after which the survivors would receive a reward based on their collected points. Jake Kwan began to move into this forest and noticed that he felt adrenaline spreading through his body. Then he, along with the rest of his colleagues, found himself in a new world. Looking at his bow, Jake Kwan thought that this was quite good, and also noticed that the forest they had to study was simply enormous. Adam immediately raised his hand and asked everyone to relax, and he said that he understood that they were all confused, but for now, they just needed to catch their breath. Suddenly, the earth beneath them began to shake. Adam immediately shouted that they were falling. However, they were obliged to remain calm. At that time, Jake Kwan regretted not thinking that animals weren't the only objects of hunting. Another group of people stopped in the middle of the forest because their leader noticed that someone was watching them. The man raised his blade and said that he knew someone was watching them. A skinny guy came out in front of them and said that he was just trying to find his team. The woman noted that it was just a child, and the leader stated that everything was fine and that they were not going to attack him. After this, the leader asked the child where he saw his team for the last time, to which the boy replied that they were dug up as soon as they got here and he was thrown back during the battle. The leader stated that it was several hours ago and they could already be anywhere. After that, he laid down his blade and said that for now he could try to stay with them. The girl immediately calmed him down and said that they would help him find his team. Hearing these words, the boy immediately thanked them. He said that he was very scared to be here alone, but his blade was covered in human blood, which did not bode well. Meanwhile, Jake Kwan and his team of braids went down. One of the guys started to panic and say that he didn't understand what they were supposed to do, and he also said that he saw some kind of humanoid. Adam immediately calmed him down and said that everything would be fine, and they would just follow step by step. Jake Kwan, looking at all this, thought that this guy really was a natural-born leader. Meanwhile, Adam finished calming everyone down and said that they needed to start by looking for a water shelter. Jake Kwan, meanwhile, was thinking that judging by the other pylons he saw when they appeared, they were probably not the only survivors, and everything they do now will be critical to learning their skills and mastering this system. Also, their team is more or less balanced, which is good news, and the skills of each of them can be useful to others. Carolina is their only healer, but she is a quick learner. This is how their first day passed, but they were unable to get food or water. Carolyn looked over and said that he was a very good archer, much to everyone's surprise. Inside us, the hero was delighted at fifth because she finally remembered his name. Adam, meanwhile, said that he understood that everyone treated him with respect because of their past work and all that, but now they were in the same boat and he could use a helping hand in difficult times. With these words, he placed his hand on Jake. Jake Kwan immediately began to say that he was not created for this and could not interact with people like everyone else. Adam looked down and slowly replied that this was a different world now, and the old rules and regulations no longer applied here. An hour later, the four of them fell asleep, and Jake and the girl with purple hair were the first guards on duty. She told him that today she and her husband were going to have lunch together, and there were several dozen meters between them when all this happened. After that, she looked at our hero and asked if he had a girlfriend. Jake Kwan looked down and answered briefly that no, but inside, he thought that he might have once called someone that. In college, he only had two real friends, Andy and Madeline. Andy was his roommate and just a good person. He was the one Jake Kwan could trust with his life, and Madeline was the one he was in love with. They were both not very sociable, enjoyed it together. It was the happiest 2 years of his life, or maybe Jake Kwan just convinced himself of it, without seeing what was happening behind him. The girl with purple hair, meanwhile, started crying and said that maybe Jake Kwan really should be alone because just thinking about her husband made her stomach twist with worry, and she couldn't stop panicking. Jake Kwan, meanwhile, looked down and thought that he needed to say something. However, he didn't have time to think of anything, and the girl had already stood up, apologizing for her behavior, and she slowly headed into the forest. Jake followed her with his gaze, thinking that Adam had accepted him. Jana had opened up to him. Caroline had even remembered his name. These thoughts made him think that maybe Adam was right, and maybe things were different here. When suddenly he heard the piercing cry of Jean, who went into the forest to clear her head. Jake Kwan immediately rushed straight after her. Meanwhile, Zana got into trouble. She was caught by a group of 3 men who demanded that she tell them where her group was. Jana tried to deceive them and said that she didn't know anything. With these words, the leader of this group swung his huge hammer and said that he did not judge her for her choice. After that, he crushed her leg with one blow, but arrows fell from the sky. One of them was killed immediately. The second one managed to defend himself with his huge axe, and the leader of the group dodged. He looked into the distance and said that he knew where it came from. One of the fighters immediately rushed forward, but found no one in that place. Suddenly, Jake Kwan appeared behind him, and with one movement stuck an arrow right into his neck. However, the difference in their strength was too great, and the man with the axe was able to push back our hero. After that, he swung his axe and threw it forward to finish him off. However, Jake Kwan took out his bow and defended himself from his axe. He looked at Jean and realized that she had lost consciousness from pain. He also noticed that another man had already appeared behind him and was swinging his hammer. Jake Kwan thought that now he might die. He closed his eyes closed. However, something inside him clicked. He had the feeling that everything around him had slowed down. But it wasn't because of magic or some kind of spell. It was pure instinct. A system appeared in front of him, notifying him that the bloodline of the primitive hunter had awakened. Our hero's gaze immediately changed. He dodged the huge hammer with ease, and then he took the arrow in his hands. And with a calm movement, he threw it forward, hit the guy with the hammer straight in the heart. Then he grabbed the blade and chopped the guy with the axe into several pieces in the air. Looking into the distance, he realized that he was not alone here, and they immediately shot at him. Jake Kwan dodged the arrows with agile movements. After that, he threw down the blade and asked for more. An archer who had run out of arrows immediately appeared in front of him. He signed up for our hero and grabbed him by the clothes. And then he swung his knife and asked who the hell this was. In an instant, Jake Kwan grabbed the arrow, and he stuck it into this idiot's forehead. And then another arrow, straight into the heart, to kill him for sure. A few hours later, the team discovered the loss, and half an hour later found Jana and Jake. Looking at this picture, they could not understand what had happened here. Jake Kwan, exhausted, said he had won. One day, when Jake Kwan was still in school, he saw one of the girls being bullied. The boys tried to persuade her to let them copy the test tomorrow. She said that she didn't want any trouble because she could get caught, to which they replied that no one would catch her. She would just have to turn over the piece of paper when the teacher wasn't looking. With tears in her eyes, the girl said that she could simply help him improve his knowledge in his studies. However, upon hearing this, one of the guys slapped her and said that she was just a waste of time. Jake Kwan immediately pounced on him, thinking that he was doing what he had to do. He grabbed this guy in a headlock. Why did you look at the girl who was still spinning around in fear? And as it turns out, in their world, when it comes to good guys and bad guys, there is no difference. So they both got suspended from school for fighting. I don't know why the manga author inserted this flashback here. However, let's return to the present. Carolina immediately began to approach Jake and say that she would help him now. Jake Kwan stood up and gathered his strength to say that the blood was not his. After this, he saw that the system congratulated him for getting 294 points, and Jake Kwan realized that he could get points for killing other survivors. He also read that he received a lot of free points, and also learned about the unique ability of the primordial hunter bloodline. Adam walked up to Jake and asked who all these guys were, and why they were attacking. To which Jake Kwan replied that it was most likely because of experience and learning points. And Jake Kwan stated that it seemed like he had learned a lot in this fight and they needed to reconsider their survival strategy. Meanwhile, Caroline was treating her leg with Jana, while Jake Kwan was talking about finding a safe place to catch her breath. Adam scratched his head and said that he had to wait until the end of his studies. When Caroline finished treating her leg, she asked Jake, "Why was Jean alone?" To which Jake Kwan replied that she felt uneasy and wanted to be alone. Carolina shouted that this changes absolutely nothing. Coming closer, she said that Jana had suffered serious damage, and now it was impossible to cure it, so it was not clear what to do now. Jake Kwan looked, and I took it out and asked if she was really blaming him for this. Adam calmed them both down and said that Jake Kwan was certainly a good man because he helped save her. However, he shouldn't have let her go alone, and he also shouldn't have gone alone to save her, and he should have woken up everyone else. Jake Kwan bowed his head and said that he was very sorry, and it was a fleeting decision where he decided to follow his instinct. Adam looked at everyone else and told Jake Kwan to think about it next time, because they are people, they are animals who act as they please, and Jake Kwan could have died here. After hearing all this, Jake Kwan said that he had already said that he was very sorry that he had done this. However, Caroline did not calm down and asked him, what would have happened if Jean had already been dead? There was a dead silence all around after this question. Jake Kwan waved his hand and said that it was time for them to finally realize the whole situation. He loudly declared that Jana survived only thanks to his actions, and if he had woken up everyone else who nobody knows how, it would have ended. After that, Jake Kwan walked up to Adam and pointed his finger at him. He said that they were people, not bears. and he doubted that anyone would want to take a person's life so quickly. Jake Kwan looked at everyone and said that the world had already changed, and they needed to stop expecting someone to lead them by the hand, so it was time for them to learn to adapt if they wanted to survive. One of the men asked what Jake Kwan was suggesting they do. Jake Kwan turned around and said that he was offering them to do absolutely anything to raise their level and survive this shit. And after that, he ordered them to do whatever the system wanted from them and not blame him for the fact that they could not catch up with him. After that, Jake Kwan went to the safe place and slept for several hours. Opened his eyes, he saw several birds in front of him, and also heard that someone was glad that Jake Kwan finally woke up. Jake Kwan was surprised to see Casper sitting next to him and said that he thought everyone else had already decided to leave him. Casper said that they thought about it, but after a short conversation they now agreed that each of them needs to have their own weight. Jake Kwan remembered that Casper used to work in the R&D department and not counting, but he thought he was the closest person who could be called a friend for our hero. They bonded over their similar life stories, and it was nice to have someone like that around. And it's still true. However, after that, Jake Kwan looked away and froze in place. He saw that Jean's leg was cut off for the sake of sending off to One Piece. However, the others convinced him that they couldn't figure out what to do with her leg, so this seemed like the best option to them, and it was her idea. Casper said that they all hope that by leveling up, Carolina will be able to learn some kind of restoration magic. After that, the whole group went to hunt monsters. Jake Kwan thought that it seems like everyone is really giving it their all today. And Bertram is definitely one of the best fighters they have in their squad right now. However, Jana is great at using her long-range magic. Despite all this, Caroline is now the most impressive of them all. And apparently what happened to my wife really awakened something inside her. Their beginner gear includes a few elixirs, but none of them are powerful enough to learn the new ones. And with no idea what else to do, Caroline really proves to be an invaluable ally. Although they still haven't said a word to each other since yesterday. In fact, Jake Kwan simply didn't understand which of them should speak first in this situation, and thought that perhaps it would be better to just pretend that nothing happened, because it sounded like a great idea. Now later, Jake Kwan decided to test his skills. He asked Casper to throw a boulder at the back of his head. Casper said that he would do so and swung. Jake Kwan, meanwhile, tried to sense the impending attack by concentrating his breathing. However, he failed, and a ball of mud stained his clothes. Jake Kwan looked back and didn't understand why he couldn't do it. Touching the dirt, he thought that perhaps the sphere of perception only works with real threats. And since Casper didn't want to hurt him, it didn't lead to anything. Meanwhile, Adam announced that it was time for them to finish for today and find a place to spend the night. After a while, they found some cave and decided that it looked pretty safe and at least they could get out of the rain. Jake Kwan started to reason that it limited the angle at which enemies could attack them. And while he remains on guard, they must be protected from the new attacks, monsters that hunt at night. Adam approached our hero and asked, "Is he still thinking about last night? Just doesn't want to repeat the same mistake twice." Adam looked at his friend and apologized for lashing out at him last time because Jake Kwan simply didn't deserve it. After this, Adam entered the cave and said that it was time for them to find a place where they could finally get some sleep. Looking at all this, Jake Kwan thought that Adam was a really good guy, and it was unknown whether the group would have survived that first day without his leadership. Once inside the cave, they heard some strange sound. Everyone immediately grouped together and prepared for the attack. Jake Kwan looked up and saw the rock starting to fall. He immediately ordered everyone to quickly leave this cave, and the whole group rushed to run away, under the rubble of stones. Jake Kwan felt something with his bloodline, and looking back, I saw that Carolina was about to be crushed by a huge stone. At that moment, Jake Kwan sped up and caught Katarina. He was able to save her from death under the rubble. However, they now found themselves cut off from the rest of the group. Jake Kwan looked at Katarina and asked if she was okay, to which she thanked him for saving her. Meanwhile, the rest of the group tried to shout to them. Our heroes loudly replied that they were here and everything was fine with them. After that, Jake Kwan put his index finger to his lips and said that they needed to be quieter because the cave was still too unstable. And then he looked back and added words about the possibility that someone might be hiding here. The girl came up to the rubble and said that there were too many of them for me to move. One of the guys said that they could try to knock down this wall. However, the team leader said that they shouldn't even touch it to avoid an even bigger collapse. After thinking a little, he also added a cool one, so that there is another path in the cave and they need to continue walking. After all, it is not necessary to meet them sooner or later. Jake Kwan heard these words and thought that maybe it wasn't true, but it was the safest option now. So he said that they would go further and try to meet halfway. However, he looked back and thought that they still didn't know what kind of animals lived here. After looking at what he thought, he would definitely be able to protect himself, but he had doubts about being able to protect the girl next to him if they were attacked. However, she smiled and said that she would never die in some cave. Hearing these words, Jake Kwan smiled and thanked her for such a positive attitude. I spent a whole hour searching for the braid and they didn't bring anything up. One of the guys said that these two are better suited to survive than everyone else here. He also added that he feels a little uneasy about our hero, but one cannot deny the fact that he is the strongest of them right now. Not to mention healing Carolina. The leader looked at him in surprise and asked what he meant by the words, "I don't feel comfortable with Jake." The second man immediately began to explain that he of course agreed with this guy, and they all needed to become stronger to survive this. However, when they found him last time, he was lying in a pool of blood and grinning like a madman. The leader lowered his gaze and said that this guy barely survived the attack, so he couldn't be blamed for such strange behavior. To which his friend replied that people change during a crisis, and Jake is now on edge. The leader turned away, saying that this was his friend and that he completely trusted Jake. Meanwhile, Caroline noticed that Jake was injured. Jake Kwan looked at his hand and said it was probably a drop. The girl came a little closer to him and said that she would heal him now. Therefore, he had better not twitch. Jake Kwan looked at her in surprise and asked, "Is she really not angry at him anymore?" To which she replied that she would not allow it to flare up earlier just because they had a fight. Jake Kwan, meanwhile, was trying his best to remember the training he had listened to in the morning, so that he could remember it and ask her at least some question to keep the conversation going. Carolina, meanwhile, said that he needed to be more careful. After all, everyone understands that he is very strong, but no one is invincible. She also added that she is just learning this magic, so she is not able to heal everything. Jake Kwan looked at his hand and asked why she decided to become a healer. The girl thought for a bit and asked a question in return. Why did Jake decide to choose an archer? To which Jake Kwan immediately replied that he chose what he does best: survival and nothing more. Suddenly, a girl sits and says that she also chose her profession for the sake of survival. After thinking for a bit, she added that she knew little about training. However, she played different games and knew that the healer was the most popular class. He smiled and Jake Kwan asked in surprise, was she really a gamer before? To which I answered, already relaxed, that it had once been her hobby. After all, her younger brother spent a lot of time in the hospital when they were still children. Sometimes she couldn't visit him for weeks, so she took the boss to play online games with him. Hearing this story, Jake Kwan was surprised and played on it because he didn't know that she had a brother. The girl, meanwhile, blushed with embarrassment and said that in any case, everyone always forced her to play as a healer because she was a girl. At first, she hated it and wanted to be a normal, ordinary fighter. But then she began to notice that the fighters always had problems finding partners. Meanwhile, being a healer, many people would go out of their way to ask her to join them. And so it didn't matter what game she played because she could always find someone who needed her, and she probably decided that this training would be no different. The girl continued to talk about how she didn't know who she would encounter here in the forest, but she knew that she could pull someone out who would be worthy of protection. Jake Kwan nodded his head and said that this was a reasonable approach to choosing a class. The girl, meanwhile, sighed heavily and asked, did Jake Kwan really think that she was stupid? Or did he never think anything about her at all? Jake Kwan thought for a moment and decided that maybe she was right because he thought he had been in love with her all this time. However, he never really thought about what she was like as a person. Finally, after a few more minutes, she completely finished healing his hand and said that it was time for them to move on. After some time, they reached a fork. Carolina visibly tensed up and asked what they should do now. Our hero's gaze changed and he asked the girl if she felt a presence. After that, after thinking for a bit, he stated that his sphere of perception was not activated, but it was as if something was not going there to eat. His look changed and he said that it was something very terrible. Meanwhile, Jake Kwan was trying to figure out inside what this feeling was that he had. After all, his instincts tell him to be careful, but part of his soul is drawn to this terrible feeling. Having collected his thoughts, he raised the torch up and said that they needed to go and check. Hearing this, the girl was surprised and asked what he had in mind. Jake Kwan looked into the caves with a magnifying glass and said that whatever was there, they needed to think about in experience points. Carolina immediately declared that they were actually looking for not experience here, but their friends. To which Jake Kwan replied that they don't know where they are now, and perhaps this path is the passage to them. To which the girl replied that if this was not so, then they would simply go straight towards danger, and besides, the other path lay at least in the direction where they had seen them last time. Jake Kwan got a little out of you and stated that There was only one path here that was guaranteed to give them experience points, and this training was aimed at getting them to go fight whatever was down there. I grabbed my head and started saying that this is real life, and Jaquan needs to think about it. So the hero thought a little, and I draw that she is right and this is most likely not logical. However, the truth is that he just wants to fight. Meanwhile, Carolina continued to explain that she understands that it's fun for him, but others don't want to risk their lives for his stupid glasses, because for them it's not a game and they're just trying to survive. Jake Kwan looked at her in surprise and asked what was wrong with wanting to become stronger. He began to explain that they had an opportunity that only comes once in a lifetime and that everything could change radically here. After all, they can do things that not a single person would have considered possible just a month ago. After these words, the girl reproached him for the fact that many of them liked what had happened before, and they didn't ask to kill them. After these words, Jake Kwan was surprised and stepped back. The girl didn't waste a moment and came even closer to him, saying that if he thought about the team for even a second and stopped behaving so selfishly, then everything would end much better. Jake Kwan looked at the cave and thought that at this rate, he would definitely not achieve anything. After that, he breathed a sigh of relief and said that in that case he agreed and they would go the safe way. Carolina thanked him for this decision, and they moved on together. After some time, the main group discussed how our heroes were feeling now. One of the guys said that Jake is with this girl now, so everything will be fine with them, because orientation in this cave is the hardest part, and he is an archer with perception. One of the fighters said that it had been quite a while, and if they didn't find them soon, they would have to think about where they would stop. The team leader said that they should continue moving forward. He was afraid. He said that they would only stop for the night, and in the morning they would be able to continue the search. He also reminded that now Jana moves on only one leg, and it is already difficult for her to walk for such a long time. Heard his name combined. The girl tensed up a little and said that she was completely fine. However, judging by her facial expression, one could think exactly the opposite. The leader bowed his head and briefly replied that they could not stop until they were sure that they were safe. When suddenly they heard someone howling, they all immediately stopped and became completely silent. Then they were called in, and the leader gave the order for everyone to prepare for battle. They looked into the cave and felt that they heard someone's footsteps. However, a second later they were relieved because they saw Jake and Caroline in front of them. The first thing the girl did was go up to Adam and hug him. One of the fighters asked if they had any problems. Jake Kwan thought for a moment and scratched his head, looking away. However, Carolina replied that everything went smoothly. And looking at our hero, she said that they just walked for a very long time to get here. After that, she said that perhaps they should find another cave to spend the night in, one that was more comfortable than this one. Suddenly, they all heard the sound of a blow and immediately turned around, seeing that Jean had finished off one of the insects with the help of her staff. The girl immediately apologized and said that she simply saw a spider and got scared. One of the group said that there is no need to kill spiders because they are very important for maintaining the ecosystem. After that, he took him in his hand and said that he was quite a nice guy. He moved away a little and released this spider, saying that he would simply take him away from sin. Turning away, he wished him a good journey. However, after that, he heard strange fur coats. Looking up, he saw that a huge pile of spiders was descending on him. Looking back, he thought that there were somehow too many of them here. Jake Kwan, take a look at it, said there might be a nest or something nearby. The others said that in that case they should hurry up. However, this guy asked them not to worry because most spiders are not dangerous to humans and everything is fine. Then suddenly one of the spiders swooped down too low and bit the guy. Jake Kwan understood why everything was going on and immediately grabbed his weapon. Meanwhile, spiders began to descend on them from above in huge numbers. Jana huddled close to her sunset group and asked, what should they do? Meanwhile, the guy who was bitten felt something coming towards him. He looked at his team with tears in his eyes and said that he couldn't move at all. And a moment later, everyone saw several pairs of huge red eyes. And finally, a huge yellow spider emerged from the shadows. The whole group stood frozen in horror before this huge monster. There was a deathly silence, and only the sound of the arrow cutting through the air interrupted it. The arrow hit the huge spider right in the mouth. Meanwhile, the leader of the group took responsibility for the guy who was paralyzed. He lifted him onto his back and started running away from there. Meanwhile, Jake Kwan was shooting back at the spider, and he was the only one who entered the duel. However, the spider had already gotten used to his attacks and fought off these shots. After a few more seconds, the spider jumped up to pounce on Jake. However, Jake Kwan only smiled in the face of danger. The rest of the group, meanwhile, tried to escape from here as quickly as possible in order to stay alive. And they shouted that they needed to leave here right now. Adam noticed that only Jake Kwan remained in the battle and shouted at him to leave. However, Jake Kwan took out his blade and shouted that he would never miss such an opportunity. He rushed at the huge monster and dealt it several powerful blows, and then, in a sliding tackle, he pierced his belly. Looking at all this, Carolina shouted that they couldn't wait only for him, to which Adam replied that he was not going to leave anyone here. And immediately after that, the spider dealt a powerful blow to the archer, which caused Jake Kwan to be thrown back. However, he immediately recovered and only wiped the dust from his clothes with the words, "And then they brayed that the spider is not bad." Meanwhile, inside, he felt something beginning to bubble up inside him. The system notified its owner that the bloodline had awakened again. He took up his weapon, ready to strike back. Noticing the falling rocks, he realized that the cave was about to collapse. However, this did not bother him at all, and he rushed forward at full speed towards danger because he decided for himself that he would not leave here until he finished what he had started. While fighting off the attacks, Monster Well thought that perhaps he was being too selfish and letting his group down. But he had long since decided that simply living was not for him, and now becoming stronger is all that matters to him. Looking at the collapse in the cave, Jake Kwan decided that he would become stronger no matter what it cost him. Adam, meanwhile, shouted that the cave was already collapsing, so they had no time to fight. However, it quickly dawned on him that Jake Kwan couldn't hear him at all and was completely absorbed in the battle. His slightly locked position allowed him to dodge blows and predict them. And at the same time, he thought about the attack he would launch against this monster. Suddenly, Jake Kwan felt someone touch him and immediately stabbed him with his dagger. However, after that, looking back, he saw that it was Adam's hand, who tried to pull his friend away. The man grabbed our hero by the clothes and said that it would be stupid to die here. Jake Kwan came out of his battle trance, and he decided that the leader of the group was true. So now they were running away from these monsters together, under the collapse of the cave. They managed to get out at the very last moment and left this spider to die under the rubble. The rest of the group looked at them and were glad that they managed to get out of there. Meanwhile, our heroes left the cave with a smile and met with their team. Carolina immediately approached the leader and said that he was bleeding and needed to be treated urgently. Jake Kwan, without hesitation, explained that he thought it was a spider and instinctively attacked Adam. Caroline glared at Jake and asked why the hell he was even trying to fight that thing. After everything that had happened to them, Adam tried to calm her down. However, their main shield took the floor, saying that he had had enough, because carelessness was one thing, but attacking a team member was a completely different matter and they could no longer let this slide. Adam looked at his hand and said that it was just a regular scratch and that Caroline could heal it. The girl looked away and agreed with this. However, she added that she also doubted Jake's actions. The others supported her and said that this was already a fundamental decision and the team could not function if this continued. The man continued to say that he was saying this as a friend, because over time, the situation would only get worse. Jake Kwan listened to all this and understood that they were indeed right, and he was now just a burden to them. However, a moment later his thoughts changed, and he thought that perhaps they were a burden to him. He began to remember that it was his worry about Jean last night that had distracted him during the fight and allowed this guy to get into his blind spot. And rescuing Carolina led him to be trapped in a cave. And also, if Adam hadn't stopped him, he would have already killed this spider and found a way to get out of this cave. Suddenly, Jake Kwan grabbed his weapon and drew his bow. He did this because he heard a strange rustling sound in the bushes. Taking aim at them, he ordered whoever was there to get out of there quickly. Otherwise, he would shoot. After these words, a man appeared from the bushes and greeted everyone. He said that his name was Richard, and they heard a noise here, so they came to find out what was going on. The man smiled and asked them not to worry because they were not going to cause harm. Adam and Jake Kwan looked at each other and nodded. After that, Adam said with a smile that he was very pleased to finally see other people. He gave his name and said that his comrades were around, and they were also not interested in conflict. After this, Richard said with a smile that this was, of course, and a large group of people immediately appeared behind him. Richard pointed to this whole team and said that his and two other groups are very similar to Adam's group, and they decided to unite to work together, so they invite all the people they find to join them. And they would also be very happy if Adam's group joined them. Richard paused for a moment and continued to say that he would understand if they didn't want to, but that working as a team had to be their common priority. After this, the man turned his attention to Carolina, and he asked if she was a healer in this case. Jake Kwan immediately realized that all this man needed was Caroline. Richard sadly began to talk about how their healer had died shortly after they entered here and they were running out of potions. After that, he placed his palm on the handle of the blade and said that it would be a revelation. They don't need the whole group, and they can take a few who want to join. And even if one healer goes to them, then it will suit him more than well. Adam looked at him menacingly and asked, what would happen if she refused? A smiling Richard said that he was a diplomatic guy and he wanted to settle this peacefully, making everyone happier. However, after this his face changed and he said that in case of refusal, he was not obliged to resolve everything peacefully. The man began to approach them and say that one way or another the healer would go with them. Looking back, Jake Kwan decided to calm down and think first. He realized that everyone was still exhausted after the cave, and only he had enough strength left to fight. However, he doesn't know how pumped up this guy in front of him is, and how many shots he will need. And also, they are in the numerical minority. Richard, meanwhile, continued to say that they would not treat Caroline badly, because they needed her. Jake Kwan, meanwhile, was noticeably nervous and thought that there were too many of these guys for them to escape, so they needed to quickly decide what to do. The group decided to get together and discuss the matter. Adam said that maybe they could just go along with them. However, the others expressed their opinion that they didn't like the way this guy was looking at them. Jana scratched her head and thoughtfully said that maybe they are such bad people, because it would be very difficult to summon any group without healers, so they cannot be blamed for what they do. Adam looked at Caroline and asked her opinion, to which she replied that she was not going to fight. The mood was surprised to realize that they had seriously decided to think about this. Meanwhile, Carolina approached Adam and put her hand on his shoulder, saying that she trusted him completely and would listen to his decision. After that, the man smiled and said that in that case they would join this group. Suddenly, Jake Kwan realized that maybe this was for the best. Jake Kwan stepped forward and turned to Richard, asking what his level was. Richard realized that Jake Kwan was a guy with whom you could negotiate and said that he was already at level 9, and in the group there were still a couple of people of level 7 and above. After that, he thought and asked what level the archer was. Jake Kwan, meanwhile, couldn't help but smile because it was just perfect. After that, he looked away and said that he was a little disappointed. He had hoped that Richard would be stronger. After that, Jake Kwan said that they didn't need the dregs and sent them packing. Adam immediately asked the archer what he was thinking about. Meanwhile, Richard got angry and said that he thought they were close to an agreement. However, it looks like everything will have to be resolved by slaughter. However, Jake Kwan waved his hand and said that Richard didn't have to worry because the rest of the team was going to join them. But Jake Kwan didn't, because he didn't have time for such small fish. After that, Jake Kwan came closer to them and said that he wanted to clarify something. He was leaving his comrades to Richard, so he had to take care of them. Otherwise, they would get into serious trouble. He smiled and asked briefly, what did he really think that he was a predator in this situation? After that, Jake Kwan delivered the legs and asked how fast his archers were. The rest of the archers immediately prepared to attack. However, Jake Kwan said that his blade would be faster than their arrows. After this, Jake Kwan laid down his arms and said that he would keep an eye on them. Friends, I spend a lot of time and effort retelling a single manhwa. It takes several days, and my videos don't always pay off. If you like what I do and want to support me or see more of this manhwa, please use the super thank you feature. It really helps. And a huge thank you to everyone who watches the video to the end. I really appreciate it. As Jake Kwan left, she thought that, according to him, Caroline would probably be safe because they needed her, and if they wanted her to be there, then at least they would protect Adam at the same time. And given this latest threat, Richard might want to think twice before dealing with the others. Adam saw that Jake Kwan was leaving the commas and stopped him. The others also approached him and asked what the hell that was. They couldn't believe that Jake Kwan had actually decided to leave them. Smiling, Jake Kwan scratched his head and said that he thought he had other sites for this training, but it would be better for them because their chances of survival would greatly increase. After that, Jake Kwan smiled and said that they shouldn't worry and that he would definitely drop by to see them sometime. Suddenly, Adam took out a box of potions and said that it would be useful to our hero. After this gesture of goodwill, Jake Kwan smiled and said he was grateful. Finally, they said goodbye and Jake Kwan left. Richard looked at one of his assistants and said that he knew perfectly well what needed to be done now. Hearing these words, the man grinned. Having gathered a small detachment, the archer separated from them and said that this was just a waste of time. After all, if they had not tried to get close to the healer, he would have simply shot this archer in the back when he left. One of the guys also said that Jake Kwan probably hadn't even reached level 5, so finishing him off would be easy as pie. And immediately after these words, he died because of 2 arrows that hit him right in the eye. The head of the small detachment began to worry and look around tenderly. After this, another member of their small group was shot dead. Everyone realized that they were about to be attacked and decided to scatter in all directions. However, Jake Kwan immediately found one person who had broken away from the rest of the group and attacked him from behind. With a sharp movement, he cut his throat and left him to die. Suddenly, another fighter shot at our hero from the blind spot of the zone. Immediately after this, Jake Kwan pulled out an arrow that hit him in the side. And then he smiled and looked back angrily at your boyfriend who shot him. However, Jake Kwan immediately noticed that he was shot at several more times, so he decided to dodge these projectiles. The rest of the archers tried to stay in the shadows and not attract unnecessary attention. After that, with a precise shot, he cut down one of the branches that fell on the leader of this small gang. The man tried to figure out where Jake Kwan had disappeared to, but Jake Kwan was already behind him. And with one precise blow, he flew his blade straight into the back of this fool. And then he twisted his blade, finally finishing off this idiot. As soon as he had dealt with the main thing, he heard a rustle and said that he knew perfectly well that there was one more person left. One of the fighters immediately came out of hiding and, raising his sword, began to beg Jake Kwan not to come near him. However, after hearing these words, Jake Kwan became even crazier. Meanwhile, Richard, along with the new members of his team, advanced. He asked who this archer was. Adam smiled and said that he didn't really have much to tell. They were just work colleagues before all this started. Richard interrupted him and said that Adam was too friendly when the guy left. Adam looked at Richard in surprise and said that he worked in the office as a manager, and being friendly with his team came naturally to him. Richard patted Adam on the shoulder and stated that it was a respectable trait, and also expressed the hope that the others did not think of him as some kind of threat, because he felt that they were all tense. The man straightened Adam's clothes and said that he assured them that none of them would be harmed in his camp because they were working together to survive, and that was a fact. Adam suddenly stopped and asked, "Do they really have a camp?" To which Richard replied that of course there was, because it would be stupid to wander back and forth looking for a place to stay every time. After some time, they reached this so-called camp, and Richard welcomed them to his base. He said with a smile that there are not so many of them, but they are growing every day. Carolina, upon entering, said that this place was simply amazing. And indeed, peace reigned here. Adam looked at Caroline and asked what she thought of this place, to which she replied that it was not a star hotel again. However, it was still better than the cave. Richard, meanwhile, began to move forward and said that one of his men would show them where they could settle down. Finally, he asked them to feel at home here. Suddenly, a man whom Jake Kwan had been sitting with ran into the camp. The guards took up arms but stopped when they realized that this was their man. The man ran up to his boss and asked what happened to their squad and where was Nicholas. Having caught his breath, the guy said that they were all dead. Richard looked at him in surprise and asked, "Did this bastard betray them and kill everyone else?" To which the fighter replied that Nicholas was also dead. Richard couldn't believe his ears when he heard these words. The guy said that it was that same archer and he suddenly attacked everyone. Richard grabbed his subordinate by the clothes and asked why he was still alive if that guy killed everyone. To which the fighter replied that Jake Kwan wanted someone to deliver a message. Looking away, the fighter said that Jake Kwan said that he fought well, and also reminded that he takes seriously what he said earlier. The boss was beside himself with rage, and held the guy by the scruff of the neck while the fighter tried to calm him down and said that this guy was just crazy because he liked it. Saying this, the fighter meant murder. Meanwhile, Jake Kwan continued to open up in the forest. He was thinking that he urgently needed to find a safe place because he had not stopped for a second since yesterday. However, at least now he has time to look at system notifications. Opening the system, he found out that he had reached the 7th level and was getting some points. Jake Kwan realized that it looks like he has leveled up several times after all the battles, and now he has some free stat points. Jake Kwan speculated that stamina or vitality might come in handy if such battles continued to occur. However, he knew that perception would probably complement his lineage, so he was left with only one option. Having collected his thoughts, he put all the characteristic points into his perception. He then looked at his stats and realized that by this point he had less than a third health left. After all, that same archer made a pretty good shot and hit vital organs. Jake Kwan stroked his wound, thinking that he needed to be more careful since he didn't have a healer with him now who could heal him. Adam, of course, gave him a few elixirs, but they needed to be saved for later. Returning from his thoughts, Jake Kwan noticed that he was surrounded by a pack of wolves. He smiled and said that it was a lucky coincidence. Meanwhile, at the camp, an unknown person approached Carolina. He greeted the girl and extended his hand to her, saying that, by the way, his name was William. The girl noticed with a smile that he looked much younger than the others, to which the guy replied that he understands this, so he tries to fit into this society as best as possible, because no one wanted to let a 19-year-old into the team, so he had to put on a show to make his skating look more menacing. However, now he insists that he is a simple guy who just wants to survive. After hearing this story, Carolina called him a poor man and said that everything was fine now and he didn't have to worry. The next day, Jake Kwan woke up surrounded by a pack of dead lions. Coming to his senses, he asked himself how long he had been unconscious. Looking at the sky, he determined what time it was based on the position of the sun. Shaking off the leaves, he thought that he was too rumpled. Although there was no particular point in preening himself if he was going to fight again anyway. Looking up, he remembered that he was now on his own, so he needed to get back to work. With these thoughts, he began to train. And look for your prey. After a few hours, he breathed a sigh of relief, already cool because he was able to reach level 10 in one day. And for him, this was quite good. Suddenly, on one of the trees, he noticed a strange light. Knocking on wood, he checked whether it was some kind of trap or not. However, he realized that he did not feel any danger at all. Jake Kwan decided that there was no other way and decided to climb a tree. Having climbed into his place, he discovered that there was a box lying in the hollow. Jake Kwan took it out, and the system notified its owner that it was a rare magic box created by the system and containing a rare and powerful item inside. Opening it, he thought that this was just ordinary loot. Inside were the leather bracers of the novice rogue, a rare item. The description said that this was a pair of bracers intended for new initiates into the Order of Umbra. They have the property of self-healing and give +5 to dexterity, +3 to strength, and also increases the effectiveness of all stealth skills. After reading all this, Jake Kwan decided that this was a good catch. And although he had no idea what the Order of Umbra was, the stats were not bad. Looking deep into the box, the hero saw that inside there was another token for upgrading basic training equipment, which could upgrade any starting item to common rarity. Jake Kwan thought about improving his bow. It would be nice, but it's pointless for now. And he decided that perhaps it was worth improving his cloak for now. After all, if this token also subjugates him, then it is definitely worth it. With these thoughts, he used the token on his cloak, and a notification popped up in front of him that his archer's cloak was now upgraded to a normal one, and also gained resistance to slashing attacks and had the property of self-healing. Jake Kwan thought about it and decided that it wasn't as impressive as the bracers, but the self-healing ability would come in handy. Climbing down from the tree, Jake Kwan looked back and decided that he needed to try to find more of these boxes, because there would probably be rarer ones located in hard-to-reach places. Jake Kwan also remembered that the spider he met in the cave was the strongest beast of all that he had met before. And if this all looks like a game, then that spider is definitely guarding something. However, Jake Kwan thought with sadness that he could no longer return there after that collapse. However, looking at the world, he thought that perhaps there would be another cave here somewhere with valuable loot. A few hours later, Jake Kwan found a similar cave. He thought that it looked a little different, and he did not feel any dangerous animals. However, down there he feels something special. Deciding that this suited him perfectly, he made a torch and went down into the cave. The first thing he found were blue glowing mushrooms, and having gone a little further, he discovered a huge door in front of him. Touching it, he realized that the wood had already rotted, which meant that the door had been there for a very long time. As soon as he touched the door, a notification popped up in front of him, telling its owner what he had discovered in the dungeon with the training quest. The entry requirements were that you had to be a class below level 10, you couldn't have a profession, and you had to be in the top 5% of the best survivors. Seeing that the conditions were met, he realized that he was in the top 5% of survivors at the moment. After that, a smile appeared on his face and he realized that he could not refuse to enter this cave. Entering inside, he found himself in a narrow cave. The walls and ceiling were covered with these glowing mushrooms. After that, a system appeared in front of him that said that the goal is to survive and pass the dungeon, eliminating all difficulties on the way, and failure to follow the rules can lead to death. After this, Jake Kwan noticed a weight on his neck. Looking down, he found that he was wearing a pendant. The system immediately revealed that this necklace of holding, an amulet given to those who entered the dungeon, allowed the user to store items in a small pocket space inside the gem. Where our hero, this was good news because this is a necklace that can be used as an inventory, and perhaps this is a hint to the tasks of this dungeon. Suddenly, the amulet began to vibrate and emit a strange glow. Right after that, a small monster quickly ran past him. Jake Kwan immediately jumped back and asked himself, what the hell was this? Jake Kwan wanted to grab his blade but found it missing. Meanwhile, the monster turned around and prepared to attack again in the air. However, Jake Kwan didn't even move from his spot and discovered that these guys were completely harmless. One of them spoke up and said that they would still see who was harmless here. As soon as Jake Kwan heard this monster talking, he stepped back in fear. After this, a spike appeared from the neighboring wall and began to fly straight at our hero. Jake Kwan immediately used his senses, and time seemed to slow down around him. He was able to return and realize that these little Alices were driving him into a trap. After that, the talking monster flew up and said to the closed one that he didn't have much time left. Jake Kwan looked down and saw that the place where the spike had hit was starting to melt, meaning he couldn't let that thing touch him. Looking at it, he asked, "What kind of shitty death trap is this?" To which the talking monster replied that he knew nothing about it, because he was just a fool who was locked in a necklace. The hero calmed down a little and asked who locked him there. The monster scratched his head and then noticed that another spike had appeared and said that our hero now has much more important problems. Jake Kwan dodged the sharp one again, and the monster laughed and said that those spikes would soon be in his ass. After that, Jake Kwan took a deep breath and decided to take care of this creature later. After all, to begin with, you just need to reach the end of the corridor. After that, Jake Kwan rushed forward at full speed towards that door. He dodged every trap that appeared in 1 second. Finally, when the corridor with traps was behind him, Jake Kwan caught his breath heavily. The monster said that Jake Kwan was moving pretty well. Jake Kwan looked at him and asked, "Is he really going to keep following him like that?" Smiling, the monster said that he had no other business at the moment. After that, they walked a little further, and Jake Kwan found himself in front of flying platforms, and there was something glowing above. As soon as he noticed it, a system appeared in front of him that said that the dungeon's test was that Jake Kwan had to collect 5 silver mushrooms in this space. Thinking about it, Jake Kwan realized that this was probably why he was given this necklace. After that, he looked at these platforms and realized that it was safe to say that these acid spikes would pop out as soon as Jake Kwan got close enough to the mushrooms. Laughing, the monster said that perhaps it was worth trying to calculate the angle of the spikes based on these holes and then try to lay out a path that would minimize the likelihood of hitting. Smiling, Jake Kwan said that of course it could be done, but there was nothing funny about it. And immediately after these words, he jumped at full speed onto one of these platforms. Immediately, the spike that was nearby shot at him, but Jake Kwan managed to return at full speed and pick up the silver mushroom. After that, he jumped onto another platform, and again the spike shot at him. But Jake Kwan thought that with the ability and speed from his bloodline, he could just go straight ahead. He then returned from another shot and picked up a second silver mushroom. After some time, he picked up the third one, and the monster sadly said that he would not react to this in any way. A couple more seconds later, and Jake Kwan took another silver mushroom, and as a result, he already had 4 mushrooms and 1 left. With a smile, Monster said that Jake Kwan was really not bad, as suddenly he heard a strange sound. It was a poisonous thorn right in front of which this without was standing. Looking ahead, the little devil realized that he didn't have much time left. Jake Kwan saw that the talking demon was in danger and instinctively rushed towards him. There was only 1 moment left before the collision. However, Jake Kwan used his speed boost and was able to catch the little devil. And then, at full speed, he flew into the door that was located above and was emitting a strange light. After that, Jake Kwan turned around and lay on his back and breathed a sigh of relief. The little devil, shaking with fear, said that he was now indebted to Jake. However, Jake had a different opinion. He walked up to this monster and started yelling at him and saying that he came here to save his pathetic ass. Smiling, the monster asked him to calm down and justified himself by saying that he had been locked in the necklace for thousands of years and was no longer as active as he had been in his youth. Jake Kwan thought for a moment and asked who was standing in front of him, to which the monster replied that his name was Cecil. After that, Jake Kwan stood up and shook off the dust, saying that his name was Jake. After thinking for a bit, Jake Kwan asked who locked him in this necklace. Cecil replied that it was a long story and he didn't want to talk about it right now. After that, the monster looked away a little embarrassedly and said that he apologized for the fact that because of him, Jake Kwan missed his last mushroom. Hearing these words, Jake Kwan just laughed. He said that the monster underestimated him, and he managed to take the last 5th mushroom when he saved him. Seeing this, the monster laughed and said in a closed voice that Jake Kwan was really good. Cecil also stated that one would have to be a complete idiot to rush through a room full of deadly traps. But even so, it turns out that our hero really does have talent. Jake Kwan slowly walked forward and thanked the monster for the compliment. When he walked a little further, he saw that in front of him was a lake of poison and small islands. Jake Kwan looked up and saw that the system was explaining to him that using the platforms he had to go through these 3 rooms, and the time limit for each was 15 minutes. After thinking for a moment, Jake Kwan said that simply jumping from platform to platform didn't sound very difficult. However, immediately after this, the system notified him that all his characteristics were reduced to 10, and all skills were disabled. As soon as he read this message, he became scared because all his power was in his characteristics. However, the system reassured its owner with the words that the characteristics and skills would be restored after the test was completed. Jake Kwan sadly dropped to his knees and said that the situation had become shitty.